Um, Welcome to this new episode of this podcast. And I'm delighted to have V N Bhattacharya with me as a guest. We are going to talk today about strategic thinking and decision making. VN is a strategy consultant and an adjunct faculty at IIM Bangalore and IIM Ahmedabad. He's been running a strategy consulting practice for 20 years now, and his course, Strategic Thinking and Decision Making, is a sought after course on the IIM campus. He's one of my role models, and when I began my independent consulting journey, I got valuable guidance from VN. Welcome, VN.
Thank you. Thank you, Vinay.
VN, how did you decide to get into strategy consulting?
Okay. So, Vinay, in 2001, I left my last corporate assignment. I was the CEO of a company. And I looked for alternative employment opportunities. Having been a CEO, I thought I was prized possession. But as things turned out, at 50 years of age, in 2001, nobody was willing to hire me. And in that process, I also began to think about what I could do. Could I create a practice independently? Um, could I help companies formulate strategies for growth, for prosperity, to do well? And I began to sort of precipitate towards the idea that I wanted to be an independent consultant. And so I went about asking a number of friends and associates. And in this consultation, most advised me that it would not be an easy road. It would be a rocky road. And actually, most of them advised me not to think of the fairly high fees that I was hoping I would be able to get, except one gentleman. He told me not to shortchange myself. So then I immersed myself for several months to study the subject of strategy from an academic point of view. I studied strategy and I studied game theory, which was of some interest to me. And then gradually, when I gained confidence that I knew a little bit, I began to launch open enrollment programs for middle and senior executives. And then that I did for a number of years, and that helped me establish my practice over time.
Great. Yeah, and that's how people like me benefited in the process. Yeah. So, can you briefly describe what strategic thinking is, VN?
Okay, so strategic thinking, Vinay, is a vast subject and it has many dimensions. And I don't think it would do well to cover all of them, but I think three principal dimensions may be of interest. One draws upon the idea that strategy has to do with attainment of an objective, of a goal. And therefore, strategic thinking can be described as goal-directed thinking. That kind of thinking that helps us and organizations achieve an implicit or an explicit goal. Another way to look at strategic thinking is to consider the very vast number of factors and variables that an individual, but more importantly, a manager or a leader in an organization has to consider to formulate a strategy. And these variety of factors could be internal or external to the organization. It could be resources, it could be cash, it could be people. It could also be the environmental influences on both the strategy of the organization as well as the outcomes. So this aspect has to do with abstract thinking, and this aspect has to do with integrative thinking. The third approach is to anticipate the choices of other players in the game. See, whether as an individual or as an organization, we are in interactive, interconnected human systems. And therefore, the outcome of our choices are deeply interactive. They depend on not just what we do, but also what others do. And therefore, it is important to figure out the impact of other people's choices on the choices that we may have. And this I like to call anticipatory thinking. And this anticipatory thinking is anchored in game theory. So, strategic thinking in sum can be described as an abstract process of solving problems or achieving one's or a firm's aspirations. It involves integrative thinking of contextual factors, and it also must involve how other players impact the game that we play. And almost invariably, whatever we do in business, there are suppliers, there are customers, and there are competitors with whom we interact. And therefore, interaction of all of these factors must take into account how the game will shape itself in the future as time progresses.
Right.
Yeah, does that help?
Yeah, it definitely helps. So goal-directed thinking, integrative thinking, and anticipatory thinking, right?
Yes.
And of course, you're saying anticipatory thinking does involve thinking deeper into the game of different multiple levels, right? I think it's a very
what kind of game it is.
Yeah.
What kind of game is it? For example, a simple game of negotiation is actually modeled in game theory as a sequential thinking. Right. And yet there are purchasing systems that use tender processes that are, for example, a kind of simultaneous games. And the element of strategy is not only that the buyer is involved in creating a game that gives him or them the advantage.
Right.
And the suppliers in turn have to also negotiate that to create advantage for themselves.
True. And these games are, you're saying, not only competitive, but also cooperative at the same time.
Yes, indeed. Very good point. Yes. Yeah. They can be competitive and they can be cooperative. Right. Yes. And as we would remember in the last, let's say 10, 12 years, we have seen cooperation emerge in the fiercely competitive telecom industry in India, the cellular telephony industry. Right. In the beginning, all of these telecom operators, they created their own towers, they created their own bandwidth, they created their own fiber networks. And then now they ride each other's fiber network. Right. On the same tower today, you will see radios of Airtel, Vodafone, Reliance, all of them, and that's cooperative behavior. Yeah. I think that's a very good example. So they choose where to compete and when to cooperate. Right.
Fantastic. Now let's try to bring in cognitive biases. How do you think cognitive biases relate to strategic thinking?
So, all strategy formulation is basically the product of the human mind. And the human mind is a wondrous equipment. It's an absolutely wondrous equipment. It helps us make life-saving decisions in the blink of an eye. Just think, you cannot cross a street by using analytical thinking. You will never cross it because the variables are just too many and they're rapidly changing. It is our intuitive mind that helps us make that decision when to cross the street, how quickly and in what direction. Right? So the human mind originally evolved to facilitate human survival. And this human survival depended on how to call the shots right in terms of fight or flight. Therefore, the intuitive mind tends to simplify complexities in order to make speedy, quick decisions. But in the pursuit of speed and simplicity, it also sometimes makes us prone to errors of judgment. And these errors are what we call cognitive biases. But it is important to emphasize that the human mind is an absolute marvel. It is responsible for the survival of the Homo sapiens as a species over millions of years. But, sometimes it also creates a cost. It comes with an instrument, right, that, makes us susceptible to biases. But the reason I want to emphasize the marvel of the human mind, just think, without the human mind the way it is, in spite of its weaknesses and flaws, it is the one that helps human beings create great art, wonderful music, engineering, technological, and other marvels.
Correct.
At the same time, you can also attribute dramatic failures of human systems and organizations to it.
And what you're saying is all kinds of thinking and strategic thinking in that sense is no different, where both these marvels and the biases, right, would be as relevant as any other kind of thinking.
Indeed, indeed. Without the marvelous human mind, there would be no SpaceX.
Right, that's true.
Right?
That's true.
And there would be no smallpox vaccine.
Yes.
Right. So.
Okay, so maybe we can start with a couple of examples where the biases adversely impacted strategic decision making that highlights that part.
Okay, so Indians particularly, those of our age and background, would probably remember the debacle that we faced in 1962 in the Sino-Indian War.
Sure.
Right? At that time, Pandit Nehru was convinced that China would not attack India. So strong was his belief that he ignored information that China was massing troops in the northern and northeastern borders of India. He did not order military preparations nor diplomatic initiatives to counter China's designs. And the result was a devastating military loss and loss of hundreds of square kilometers of territory in that war. So Nehru's decision or passivity can be attributed to confirmation bias. Now, at today's context, it might be fashionable to blame Nehru for many other things.
Right.
But the reason why we are discussing it, that Nehru was otherwise a very balanced and a very straight thinking person. And yet, he was susceptible to a bias of such grave magnitude.
Sure. Right.
On a day-to-day basis, one of the ways in which bias is, leveraged to one's advantage,
Right.
is what smart salespeople do.
Okay.
And I like to give this example in my class, particularly to the young ladies. And I tell them, look, when you go out to buy a nice sari or a dress, right, you probably begin with a budget in your mind. But when you go to a shop and you ask for a dress or a sari to be shown, a smart salesperson would almost invariably show you a beautiful sari that is about 20% or 30% over your budget. And you, of course, being the intelligent people you are, you would reject that option. But now that higher price is anchored in your brain. And you may end up buying, there's a high likelihood that you may end up buying a sari that is more expensive than the budget you came there with.
Yeah.
And this is anchoring bias.
Okay.
Right? Empirically, smart salespeople learn
Right.
how to leverage anchoring bias in their customers.
Right.
So
bias.
it cuts both ways.
Yeah. So you're saying it has this both sides. One is,
Yes, of course.
example highlights that it has a slippery slope. And,
yes.
This second example points out that you can leverage it to your advantage as well.
Yes. But remember, the customer in this case is the one that suffers.
That's true.
And bias necessarily means that there is an error of judgment that led to a suboptimal choice.
Okay, that's right. Okay. So maybe we can also look at the other side where somebody overcomes. See, biases can be overcome as well. I mean, that's one school of thought. So Can you give some example where bias was overcome during
Yes.
strategic decision-making process?
Well, yes, but the problem with finding such examples is that the inner working of a person's mind is rarely revealed to others. So we have to infer from available evidence and the behaviors of individuals involved. And a good example of this, perhaps, would be the 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis. So, for many of your listeners and viewers, 1962 might be a little way back in time,
Right.
but it was a very dramatic instance. At the height of the Cold War, after the Second World War, your Soviet Union began to secretly ship ballistic missiles in Cuba, and they had begun to secretly install and make them operational. Their aim was to neutralize America's strategic nuclear advantage. Missiles launched from Cuba could now target all major American cities. USSR based missiles could not hit American mainland,
Okay.
whereas US missiles based on the US mainland could target every corner of USSR at that time.
Okay.
So this imbalance weighed heavily on Nikita Khrushchev's strategic mind. Now, evidence of this covert operation was soon discovered by US reconnaissance aircraft. US military advisors then told the president, John F. Kennedy, to launch an all-out air, land, and sea attack on Cuba to take out all the missiles. Some of the missiles, however, were already operational and could be launched on America. Kennedy took into account the very large number of civilian and military casualties that would occur on both sides, and the very real possibility of a nuclear war between the two great powers at that time. And he went against the advice of his military. He ordered a naval quarantine of Cuba. The quarantine, a blockade really, would now prevent any further arms shipments into Cuba and effectively demonstrate the muscular and determined US response. With the quarantine in place, he then asked USSR to unconditionally withdraw all nuclear missiles from Cuba. A process of negotiation followed, but Khrushchev, then the Soviet premier, backed down and agreed to dismantle all missiles and ship them back to the Soviet Union. A nuclear catastrophe was hanging by a thread. It was averted.
So in this case,
So here,
yeah,
it was all too easy for John F. Kennedy to be taken in by the advice of his experts, the military experts, right? And they were hawks. US military had also suffered an indirect setback some time ago in a previous year when their Bay of Pigs invasion in Cuba was pushed back. Right? And I'll come to that in a moment. But John F. Kennedy, so what is not clear to us is how John F. Kennedy's mind worked during that time.
right.
But it is clear that he contemplated. It is clear that he heard all sides and all points of view. It is also clear that he took several actions to mitigate the risk of a nuclear war. For example, he sent his brother, Robert Kennedy, to negotiate, to sort of negotiate, not overtly negotiate, with the Soviet ambassador in the United States, Alexander Dobrynin. In other words, he was opening a side avenue for diplomatic exchanges. So Kennedy, in my opinion, was able to overcome the bias that he may have been susceptible to. But the same example, incidentally, Vinay, is a wonderful story of how Khrushchev, on the other hand, was susceptible to the opposite kind of bias.
I see.
So in 1961, the Bay of Pigs invasion which was launched at the behest of the CIA. In fact, CIA had armed, financed, and trained Cuban exiles in Florida in US and made them ready. And they landed at the shores of Cuba to create an insurrection and coup. But the Cuban military defeated that. Khrushchev saw in this a weakness of President Kennedy. President Kennedy was a first-time president of the United States. And he felt that he was a weak decision maker. He was a weak president. And that even if the missiles in Cuba were discovered, the response of the United States will not be robust. But as you know, America did not take this as a fait accompli. And ultimately, the Soviet debacle from the missile crisis cost Khrushchev his premiership. 2 years later, he was removed by the USSR Presidium. And he spent the rest of the years of his life in a fairly ignominy, you can call it, or certainly far, far away from public notice.
I see.
Till he died
in
1971 at the age of 77.
So I agree with you. So you're saying these are examples where you can really see cognitive biases can play a big role.
Yes.
Not just on one decision, but for many years, its impact could last.
Indeed.
And of course, it would also affect the person's career, perhaps forever.
Yes, yes. But you can just imagine, the Cuban Missile Crisis could have ended very differently.
That's very true.
And there would have been a nuclear holocaust all over the world.
I mean, it can be really devastating.
Yes. I mean, just to stress the point, America at that time had 5,000 nuclear warheads.
Ooh.
So you can imagine.
I can.
Even a few hundred fired would have caused mayhem all over the world.
That's true. So VN, you are also an avid mountaineer. You've been high altitude mountaineer. And mountaineering, especially the high altitude mountaineering in Himalayas, is also a very, can potentially be risky endeavor. So is there any example you can remember or can tell us where both biases or decision making impacted? Yes.
Well, yeah, interestingly, you say this. So my first experience of a significant high altitude trek, and actually I'm not a mountaineer because mountaineering involves very much of technical climbing.
Right.
I am a trekker really. So as long as it's a gently sloping or even steeply sloping, I can manage it, but technical climbing is beyond me. So I was undertaking what I subsequently learned was one of probably the toughest trek in the Garhwal and Kumaon Himalayas.
Sure.
I didn't know it was that tough, but I thought I was physically ready. And we were doing the crossing of what is called the Kalindi Pass, which is at about 19,500 feet.
Okay.
So 5 days into the trek, we arrived at high altitude meadow called Nandanvan. And I made very heavy weather of the climb from Tapovan. You come down to Gangotri Glacier, you cross the Gangotri Glacier, and then you climb up a steep slope to Nandanvan. It was very tough. And I realized that I was not physically prepared for it. If this is what I was struggling with at 15,000 feet, how would I ever do 19,000 feet?
Sure.
So I thought through it through the night. And the next morning, which was a rest day at Nandanvan, I told my expedition leader that I have to call it off. And a lot of people persuaded me, said, no, you can make it, you can do it, etc., etc. But I called it off. And that was a very, very big disappointment.
Okay.
But subsequently, I have thought that perhaps I was a bit risk averse. Perhaps my judgment of my capability was somewhat flawed. But on the other hand, I also think of to myself, what if I had not
Yeah.
made an error,
Right.
right? What would have been the cost of that risk?
That's true.
Right? So that was one story. And the other one involves a bunch of my students from IIM Ahmedabad. So many years ago, um, one of the girls from my class, the PGP executive batch of IIM Ahmedabad, she wrote to me an email saying that she and some of her batchmates at the end of the course had gone on a trek. I don't remember where they went. I think they were trekking to Kumari Pass, which I suspect is at about 15,000 feet or 14,500 feet. And at about 11 or 12,000 feet, the weather changed for the worse. They had gone very early in the season. It was March. And it began to snow heavily the night they were in their tents. And it snowed incessantly for 2 or 3 days. This is generally unusual at 11 or 12,000 feet. But this girl wrote to me saying that they sat down one evening in the tent, and all of them were, at least some of them were my members of my class on strategic thinking and decision making. And they said they relived that the particular class in which I taught Daniel Kahneman's prospect theory, where he talks about judgment under uncertainty of risk. And they decided that they would abort the trek. And they came back.
Right.
So I can only say that those students, those youngsters, were wise, because they had their whole lives ahead of them. Right? And a bad mistake could be very expensive.
True. Fantastic example.
And it is not as if they were expert trekkers.
Climbers, yes.
Yeah.
Right. But I guess the examples you gave was, on one hand, there's Kennedy, who is also a president of high caliber. There are presidents like Khrushchev, and also there are amateurs. So I guess it's really applicable across the range. This whole biases affecting and perhaps mitigating that as well. So, Vian, what would be a few strategies one could employ in either mitigating or overcoming biases while taking such crucial strategic decisions?
So strategies for individuals and for organizations can be different. But they spring from some principal ideas. And the single most important principal idea is that second thoughts are better. And what is meant by second thoughts, obviously, is the outcome of deep thinking, of reconsideration, careful reflection, re-examining one's underlying assumptions, keeping an open mind for alternatives, and actively seeking other points of view. These are good debiasing strategies.
Right.
Careful and deeper thinking allows one to discover erroneous assumptions and uncover alternatives that one may not have considered earlier. Seeking others' views is a way of challenging one's assumptions and to rigorously examine pros and cons of various choices.
Right.
But it doesn't come easy. It doesn't come easy because we remain supremely confident of our choices, of our wisdom, of our experience.
Right.
Organizations, some actually inculcate this culture of vigorous discussion and constructive debate before making important decisions.
Right.
Some of them, another strategy they use is to appoint a devil's advocate.
Right.
A person that is known to be opposed to the proposal.
Okay.
He or she is appointed the devil's advocate. And her job is to present to the group and argue why the proposed actions might prove costly for a variety of reasons. Another suggestion some academics have made, and one of them that I value, whose opinion I value greatly, is Gary Klein. They suggest a strategy called pre-mortem.
Yeah.
And this is an interesting approach, Vinay.
Yeah.
Here, a group of people are asked to place themselves at a time in the future. And imagine that the strategy being proposed today has failed miserably. Now they're asked to articulate various reasons why it failed. And this method is particularly useful in uncovering unforeseen pitfalls ahead of time. So Daniel Kahneman, perhaps the father of behavioral economics, recommends one should slow down thinking.
Okay.
And take time over important decisions. Once you allow yourself time, you can reflect, you can contemplate, you can ask people, you can take other opinion, you can do some more research, and so on.
Very good tips. So in some sense, the ancient wisdom of sleeping over a decision perhaps could capture some of these aspects.
Indeed. Absolutely. Yeah.
But if I just look at various tips that you gave, I'm just trying to see, maybe sleeping over is a little easy, but do you think talking to others, is that the tougher thing for an individual usually? Suppose I'm overconfident in really getting,
Yes.
Yeah.
Indeed. See, we will only bring ourselves to talk to others
Right.
if we have an iota of doubt.
That's true.
And that iota of doubt can only be created by reflection.
That's true.
So the two go hand in hand.
Yeah.
But it is not important. It must be remembered that one should not consult people just for the sake of consultation. We must seek out people who may not possess the same kind of biases as we do.
Okay.
Who have a different context.
Right.
Who have a variety of experiences. Whom we may consider wiser. But wisdom is not necessarily a function of age.
Yes.
Simply because somebody is not in quite the same place and time as we are, can imbue wisdom on the other person. Right?
That's a very good point. Yeah.
Yeah. One of the things that I like to say is that a prerequisite for consulting others is high self-esteem.
Okay. Interesting. You're saying I should be feeling good first of all before I approach somebody else. Okay, that's a very good point.
Yeah, I mean, if we are weak inside, we will always tell ourselves we know better, and there is no need to consult someone.
Yes. Yeah. In some sense, I'm afraid that my weakness can be exposed in the process, and
yes.
I may be fearful of.
Or if someone does advise me,
yeah,
I may reject that suggestion.
That's correct. Very good tips, V N. I mean, we are sort of close to the end. Any concluding things on this whole range that we discussed that you feel to the listeners on strategic thinking and biases story?
Well, I'm reminded of an interview that I saw briefly of Daniel Kahneman, who, as you know, won the Nobel Prize for Economic Sciences in 2003, I think.
Yes, 2002, yeah.
He was asked in an interview, he was told, look, you are the father of behavioral economics. Your contribution to that subject, to the idea of heuristics and biases and good quality decision-making has been immense. Has it improved your decision-making? And Kahneman's answer was, no.
Okay.
And this is paradoxical.
Yes.
Here's a person that we would consider wise. We would consider as who knows almost everything there is to know as of in that knowledge, in that subject today.
Right.
And he says no.
Yeah.
And it's very important to understand why he did that.
Sure.
And this is because we ourselves cannot see bias in ourselves. We can see bias in others. Because we cannot see bias in ourselves, our instinct remains to go by our intuitive judgment. But therein lies the strategy. If we can see bias in others, so can others see bias in us.
Yes.
And this brings us to the idea of constructive discussion and debate.
Sure.
Or consultation.
Right.
It is because others can see, they might be able to give us better advice.
Yeah.
Right.
So the other is, you're saying, is we can look at it as a mirror where I'm seeing my bias.
Yes. Yes. So the problem of the mirror is that we look into the mirror to see ourselves. And that doesn't help very much.
Okay.
The only way it can help is if we have taken sufficient time to reflect and introspect.
Right.
Then it does. Sometimes the mirror cracks.
Correct.
Right. But to ask someone else to create an environment in which dissent flourishes.
Right.
As Adam Grant writes in one of his new books, to create a challenge network.
Okay.
People who can challenge us.
Yeah.
Right. These are the stuff of what we might call deliberate strategies.
Okay.
To debias ourselves, to make important judgments and important decisions by minimizing the risk.
Right.
Now, as I like to say, it doesn't matter very much that we make small errors of judgment, but it is the crucial ones, it is the big ones that can change everything, right? And in the class, I often give the example of Ramalinga Raju.
Okay.
Right? He created Satyam. For 8 years, for 8 consecutive years, he cooked the books. Because each year he became more and more afraid that if he owned up, he would not only go to jail, he will lose the company that he was trying to protect. Right? And so that, according to Kahneman's prospect theory, is about, he was in the domain of losses. If I do X, I lose. If I do Y, I lose. So faced with 2 choices, both of which will result in losses, we tend to become more risk-seeking. And that's what Ramalinga Raju did.
Yeah.
Now, he can be vilified, but the truth is that any one of us are just as susceptible unless we create mechanisms and strategies to protect us from bad judgment, our own bad judgment.
Right. No, I think this is a very good example, especially in the Indian industry, which anybody who has lived this period can remember. And what you're saying is, it may appear to some that, okay, Ramalinga Raju is of some different category, but you're saying, no, all of us, there's a Ramalinga Raju in each of us who can potentially slip over.
Yeah, I would only make a cautious, sound a word of caution here, because a lot of people see Ramalinga Raju's actions through the lens of ethicality. And he was indeed unethical. Right. What he did was both illegal and immoral. Sure. But the point is that immorality can also be caused by cognitive biases.
Okay. Right. And that's what all of us are susceptible to.
Yes. To a greater or lesser degree.
Yes. And I like what you're saying. The deliberate strategies could be slowing down, asking for feedback from people with varied contexts and different kind of wisdom. And the term you also mentioned was challenge network. Maybe that's something to look at as to, yes, can I really create a challenge network at all? And you're saying
that's an idea that Adam Grant has proposed.
Yeah, but
I have a bunch of friends or experts to whom I can go and say, look, this is the way I'm thinking. What do you think?
Yeah.
And they challenge my thinking.
That's correct. Yeah, I remember. I mean, it has been very helpful for me having collaborators while writing books or even during discussions in programs. And I think when I discuss with you also some of these things, I remember on biases and strategic thinking, your point of view also has been very helpful. So I agree with you. So having people to challenge and this pre-mortem, I think that's also something. I wonder how much of it is really experimented with in the Indian corporate sector. But I think it's definitely a tool which is has potential and promise. So VN, it was really a pleasure to chat with you and hear the wisdom of strategic thinking and various cognitive biases and wonderful examples from both your personal side as well as at various country side as well. Yeah, the strategic national Holocaust related decisions. So thank you so much, and it was really a pleasure and having you. Yeah.
Thank you for asking, Vinay. Take care. I enjoyed being with you and discussing these things. This is a subject very close to my heart.
Great. All right. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.